Ever since the beginning of the Final Fantasy franchise, jobs have been there as one of the foundational elements. The first game featured only 6 jobs, and many of them were staples of the genre, but there was also some room for innovation thanks to the Red Mage. That notion was then pushed much further following the release of Final Fantasy 3, 4, and 5, as more and more unique jobs entered the fray. But as time has passed and the franchise has only continued to grow, so too has the volume of jobs. Alongside the quintessential jobs such as Monk, Warrior, and White and Black Mage, this means plenty of others have featured, and there are now well over 100 unique jobs within the roster. In a recent video, there was actually some doubt about this number, so it felt like the perfect time to dive into the archives to bring out yet another selection of very obscure jobs that have seldom featured as the franchise is built out. For reference, if you'd like to watch the previous video, there's a link in the description below. Now, as usual, we're going to work with the stipulation of only focusing on one job entry per game. And we're going to start off with the Red Mage's forgotten cousin, the Green Mage. After introducing 3 coloured mages within the very first Final Fantasy, another, the Blue Mage, was introduced in Final Fantasy V. Many different types of mages would also feature around this time, but they were given specific purposeful names such as Magus, Summoner, or Time Mage. It wasn't until Final Fantasy XII that another coloured school of magic was introduced, as in that game, players were given access to green magic. Serving as a reclassification of certain white and black magic spells, green magic had a specific focus on enfeebling and enhancing magic, such as Protect and Shell, but also Blind and Sleep. However, as Final Fantasy XII, at least in its original format, had no specific jobs, there was no notion of an actual green mage being made available to the party. But they did exist in the world. Within the bestiary, a named green mage called Lonlo was mentioned in relation to the Pyrolist enemy, who gave a hint around the Giga Skier Bazaar entry. In the following years, the lore of Ivalice was built out in significant fashion, and numerous jobs were introduced via Tactics Advanced, Revenant Wings, and the International Zodiac job system. But it wouldn't be until the release of Tactics A2 that we got our first actual green mage, and the role was exclusive to the Viera race. 8 spells were made available for the player to use, and they varied between offensive and defensive buffs and debuffs. Many were carried over from Final Fantasy XII, but Trank and Leap were unique, and as a collective ability set, they provided green mages with a lot of utility, making them very valuable party members. After a successful appearance in Tactics A2, green mages also appeared in Knights of the Crystal, a very loose Ivalice spin-off, and in more recent times in War of the Visions. Here, numerous characters had Green Mage as their designated job, but it was also assigned as a sub-job for certain characters, such as Y'shtola and Yuna. Final Fantasy III built upon the original game by featuring many of the same jobs. But to keep things interesting, the developers also introduced some original concepts. Some of them, such as the Noble and the Hypermonk, ended up being cut throughout development, but others, such as the Dragoon, Summoner, and Geomancer, were retained for the final build. And then there was the Viking. Compared to many of the other jobs, which had a rooting in tabletop gaming or wider fantasy, the Viking felt a bit more unorthodox. But it did make sense, as the developers had started to lean more into Norse mythology as a source of inspiration. It's perhaps for this reason that each of the Vikings' hammers was aligned with the lightning element, which was similar to Thor. Many of the jobs featured in Final Fantasy III were given a unique command that helped to differentiate them, outside of equipable weapons and attributes. But the Viking, like some of the other melee jobs, was not so lucky. Due to the original Final Fantasy III being quite basic in terms of its available commands, this meant the Viking had no specific ability, and as their stat growth was slower than their contemporaries, they meant that outside of attempting to exploit a lightning-based weakness, there wasn't really much point in using the Viking job outside of wanting to experience everything the game had to offer. Perhaps because of this muted appearance, Vikings drifted into the background after this point, overshadowed by many of the other melee-based jobs. There was, however, a faithful recreation featured within Tactics A2, and the Viking job has also been ever present in many of the mobile games that have focused on history, such as Airborne Brigade and Record Keeper. Now, the first two jobs we featured have quite obvious practical applications. One was a mage, capable of aiding the party through the use of enhancing or enfeebling magic, while the other was a brute force melee damage dealer. That then makes our next entry quite intriguing, as it performed a similar application to the Green Mage, albeit from a very different perspective. Jugglers have been synonymous with the circus for a very long time, able to thrill audiences with their ability to toss and manipulate multiple objects at the same time. In that particular setting, it makes perfect sense, but it doesn't quite make sense in a more combative setting. There has been a resurgence in real life thanks to the advent of combat juggling, which is a very interesting sport, but even that relates to attempting to prohibit the opponent's ability to juggle as opposed to trying to cause them physical harm through the act of juggling. That's what makes the appearance of the juggler job in Tactics Advance pretty interesting. The job was exclusive to Mughals, who had learned to use their juggling talents to juggle harmful objects and then hurl them at enemies when they were least expecting it. This not only enabled jugglers to deal decent physical damage, but also enfeeble their opponents with quite logical status effects. For example, by using the Ring ability, they would throw a hoop to inflict stop, and when using Firebomb, they went a bit rogue by throwing Molotov cocktails at their opponents to inflict Berserk. Perhaps due to its quirkiness, the juggler then returned in Tactics A2 and Airborne Brigade, complete with clown makeup. But perhaps the most surprising reappearance came via Brave Exvius, where the juggler was a rare summon. After the release of Final Fantasy V, outside of the MMOs, jobs started to become a seldom used part of the franchise. But after working on the successful remakes of Final Fantasy III and IV, Takashi Tokita wanted his new, original Final Fantasy to have a strong focus on jobs. The idea was for the Four Heroes of Light to have all the hallmarks of the 8-bit and 16-bit era, and with jobs playing such a prominent role, it made perfect sense for them to return. However, to ensure things were kept somewhat fresh, they were renamed to Crowns, and there were some very innovative concepts at play. In that regard, focus has to be placed on the Storyteller Crown, which could be acquired after defeating Roland and Recruiter in the Mysterious Lighthouse. In application, the Storyteller was quite similar to the Freelancer class, as it was proficient in every type of weapon and had access to abilities that had previously been learnt from other crowns. However, due to its proposed use as an end-game crown, the Storyteller had almost zero stat growth. When used at level 99, this meant the Storyteller had the potential to be the most powerful crown in the game, and a valuable asset to the team. But, perhaps due to the niche nature of the Four Heroes of Light, Storyteller has never been explicitly referenced in any other game in the franchise since. Excluding the pixel remasters, quite often when older Final Fantasy games have been remade or remastered, the development teams have tried their best to include a ton of extra content as a way of coaxing back older players. This often comes in the form of bonus dungeons and super bosses, but the Game Boy Advance version of Final Fantasy V also added in a few bonus jobs too. 4 new jobs ended up being added, and they were each very different from the jobs that were already available in the main game. But the Oracle stood out due to its alignment with Soothsaying. It offered by far the highest magic stat modifier. But what made the Oracle quite special was that even though it could be very strong, it could also easily end up hindering the party. Its main command, Condemn, allowed the use of abilities without there being any MP cost, with the time to execute being determined by the Oracle's level. The difficulty, though, was that the ability used was random. This meant, alongside powerful abilities such as Black Frost and Judgment, which dealt elemental damage, Condemn could also enact Recuperation and Rejuvenation, which removed all negative statuses and restored HP. This sounds great, but the problem was that the target would be the opponent, not the party. The other main command was Predict. This again saw the Oracle use spells from a specific list, but this time the ability used was based on the last digit of the caster's current MP before casting the move and deducting the required MP to cast it. For example, if the MP digit was 0, then the Oracle would use Cleansing to deal major non-elemental damage to all enemies, whereas if it was a 9, the Oracle would use Pestilence, which dealt very powerful non-elemental damage to the party. The Oracle job was retained for the notorious 2013 re-release of Final Fantasy V on Steam, but it was unfortunately removed from the Pixel Remaster version. Now, we've mentioned Airborne Brigade a few times throughout this video. It served as one of the original free-to-play mobile games and featured designs from Monster Octopus, who also lent their talents to Theatrhythm. Due to when it was released, Airborne Brigade was designed to be a simple, effective, and addictive Final Fantasy experience. And at its core, it allowed players to customize their characters much like an MMO, but the array of jobs available was pretty extreme by comparison due to how simplistic the game was. The basic tutorial jobs served as a reference to the original Final Fantasy, but beyond that, there were plenty of references to some lesser-known jobs to appear from across the franchise, and even some original ones too. And in that regard, the most obscure has to be the Blacksmith. Appearing as a special job, Blacksmith served as a prerequisite to the Blue Mage, but due to how genuinely obscure the job is, and with Airborne Brigade now having its service terminated, there's not that much actually known about how the job even worked. So we're just going to leave it there. Which brings us on to the last job on the list, which featured in another quite crazy game, Tactics S. With both the Ivalice and Tactics brands exhausted, Square Enix attempted to try and bring fans of the original game back by creating a free-to-play mobile gacha game. To make the game appealing though, the developers attempted to create a huge roster of jobs, with new jobs appearing alongside those inherited from the 3 previous Tactics games. It led to a ton of crazy jobs, and one of the more unique has to be the Vampire. The job was exclusive to the Grier race, which had appeared in Tactics A2, but there was only access to one ability, Dark. Perhaps the most interesting aspect though was that this was the 3rd iteration of the Vampire. The job had first debuted in Knights of the Crystals, which, as previously mentioned, took direct inspiration from Tactics. This game featured more jobs than any other game in the entire franchise, over 100 in fact, within just a single property. And amongst the huge roster were 2 forms of vampire. After this, Bravely Default, another game with a strong association to Final Fantasy, also featured the vampire job. This iteration, however, was much more expansive, featuring a whole host of abilities that led much more into the inherent nature of vampires. But with that, they were 7 more obscure jobs from across the entire Final Fantasy franchise. Be sure to let us know in the comments below which of these you knew about and have actually used. And of course, if you enjoyed the video, please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more content. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Gregory, Juan Jaramillo, Justin Dent, and Sukun TDK, who are super special Onion Knight supporters. And of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.